Welcome back, everyone, to the Bechange Center for Autism podcast. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready.
Today, we're tackling something that I know a lot of families struggle with. It can be really tough. Severe food aversion in children with autism.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've got an awesome guide here. It goes way beyond those surface level tips you see everywhere. We're going to really try to understand the WHY behind it all.
Sure.
How it can actually impact a child's health. And we'll leave you with some seriously practical strategies to make meal times more peaceful for everyone.
That's the goal.
And nutritious too, of course. Got to make sure those kiddos are getting what they need.
Absolutely. One of the things that really struck me about this guide is how it starts by highlighting just how common this issue is. It cites that something like 70 to 90% of autistic children experience food aversions, to some degree at least.
Wow. 70 to 90%, that's a huge number.
Right.
It's definitely not just a picky eater situation. There's often so much more going on. As ABA therapists, one of the first things we consider is sensory processing.
Yeah, for sure. And this guide does a great job of explaining how heightened sensory sensitivities, which we know are so common with autism, they can really make those everyday sensations overwhelming, especially when it comes to food.
Right.
It's like everything is amplified, the taste, the texture, the smells, even just the look and the sound of food.
It's not just about the taste, it's the whole sensory experience. I had a client who would only eat food that was beige. Any other color, and it was an automatic no.
Oh, wow. That's a classic example. How that visual input can play such a huge role. And the guide gives some other really vivid examples, too. Like a child rejecting food solely based on the smell, before even tasting it, or a child who only eats crunchy foods because softer textures are just upsetting.
I've seen that, too.
Yeah.
A child who would only eat dry cereal, no milk. The sogginess was just too much. So how do we, as ABA therapists, even start to address these sensory challenges?
Well, one of the core principles of ABA therapy is breaking down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable steps. We call this task analysis.
Okay.
And in the context of food aversion, this might involve gradually introducing new textures or flavors.
Can you give an example of how that might work in practice?
Sure. Let's say a child only eats crunchy foods. We wouldn't start by introducing a completely different texture, like mashed potatoes. Instead, we might begin with a slightly softer, crunchy food, like a graham cracker, and work our way down what we call the texture hierarchy slowly.
So it's about creating a gradual transition, not a sudden shift.
Exactly. And we also use a technique called desensitization, where we gradually expose a child to the sensory input they're avoiding.
Okay.
So for example, if a child is really sensitive to certain smells, we might start by having them smell the food from a distance, and then gradually move it closer over time.
That makes sense. And while we're working on those sensory sensitivities, it's also crucial to address the potential nutritional impacts of these limited diets, right?
Oh, absolutely. This guide is very clear that a restricted diet can impact everything, from growth and immunity to even cognitive function.
It's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah, it can be. Deficiencies in key nutrients, like vitamins D and B12, calcium, iron, and omega-3 fatty acids are unfortunately common.
We need to take this seriously. So how do we balance those nutritional needs with the sensory and behavioral challenges?
Well, one strategy we often employ is called food chaining, which is explained really well in this guide. It involves introducing new foods that share properties with accepted foods.
What?
So if a child loves chicken nuggets, we might introduce a similar shaped food, like a fish stick, and then move to something with a slightly different texture, like baked chicken.
That's a clever approach. It's like building a bridge between the familiar and the new. I've seen that work wonders. But we also need to consider the behavioral side of things too, right?
Absolutely. The guide emphasizes that routine and predictability are crucial for many autistic children. Any change, including new foods, can be really anxiety-provoking.
I've seen that firsthand. One of my clients had a total meltdown when I tried to introduce a new color cup at snack time. The routine was disrupted, and it took a while to get back on track.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. So when we're trying to expand a child's diet, it's so important to incorporate these new food trials into their existing routine. For example, we might designate a specific day and time for trying new foods and make it a predictable part of their week.
So it's not just about what we're offering. It's about how and when we present it.
Exactly. Consistency and predictability can make a world of difference. We can also use visual supports, like a picture schedule, to help prepare the child for what's coming next.
I like that. It takes the guesswork out of the situation and reduces anxiety for everyone. And I think that ties into the broader idea of creating a positive mealtime environment.
Absolutely. The guide is really strong on this point. Minimize stress during meals. Create a calm atmosphere. Stick to a consistent schedule. And minimize distractions as much as possible.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Right, but so important. No TV, no toys. Just focus on the food and the social interaction.
It sounds so simple, but I know it can be really tough to implement in the real world. I've seen parents resorting to all sorts of tactics just to get a few bites into their child.
I know. And the guide actually cautions against relying too heavily on rewards. While a small reward might be helpful initially, the goal is to foster intrinsic motivation, the enjoyment of food itself.
Right.
We want the child to associate mealtime with positive experiences, not just those external rewards.
So it's more about creating a positive association with food and less about bribing them to eat.
Exactly. One way to do this is to involve the child in meal preparation. Let them help wash vegetables, stir ingredients, or set the table.
I like that.
This gives them a sense of ownership and control, making them more likely to try the food they helped create.
That's a great tip. I've also found that modeling positive eating habits can be really helpful. If the child sees their parents and siblings enjoying a variety of foods, they're more likely to be curious and open to trying new things themselves.
For sure, family involvement is key. And I think that's a great segue into the next section of the guide, which focuses on practical strategies for success.
Okay, let's dive into those strategies. I'm eager to hear what this guide recommends for tackling those sensory sensitivities head on.
This guide does a fantastic job at breaking down practical strategies based on each sense. So let's start with taste. You mentioned a child who only ate beige food for taste sensitivities. We often use a technique called flavor masking.
Okay, I've heard of that. What exactly does it involve?
It's pretty straightforward. You pair a new or challenging food with a familiar and preferred flavor, just to make it a little more palatable.
Okay.
So say a child loves ketchup, but won't touch broccoli. You could offer a tiny bit of broccoli dipped in ketchup, and that familiar taste can make the broccoli more approachable.
So it's about using those safe foods as a bridge to new flavor.
Exactly. And we can do the same for texture. The guide talks about using a food texture hierarchy. You start with the texture the child already enjoys, and then gradually introduce variations. For example, if they love crunchy crackers, you might try a slightly softer cracker, then a small piece of soft bread.
It makes sense. Small changes over time. I remember working with a child who would only eat smooth purees. Any little lump or bump and they'd gag. It was heartbreaking to see them so limited.
Oh yeah. Those are tough cases. That's where patience and creativity come in. I mean, we had one case where we started by adding just a tiny sprinkle of finely crushed graham crackers to their puree, just a hint of a different texture. Over time, we increased the size and amount of those crunchy bits. It took months. But eventually, they were eating things like soft cooked vegetables.
That's amazing. What about smell? I've encountered some kids who are incredibly sensitive to strong odors.
Yeah, smell can be tough. The guide suggests reducing odors during cooking and serving. You know, simple things like serving food at room temperature or making sure the kitchen is well ventilated can help.
I've even used a diffuser with calming essential oils during meal times, just to create a more pleasant sensory experience.
That's a great idea. Creating that calm, inviting atmosphere is so important. And speaking of atmosphere, let's move on to visual sensitivities. Remember that child you mentioned who only ate beige food? Visual presentation matters.
Absolutely. I've learned to keep things simple, plain plates, minimal distractions on the table. And no surprises. If we're introducing a new food, I always show it to the child first. Let them touch it, smell it, get familiar with it before even asking them to taste it.
That's great. Those are all excellent strategies. The guide also emphasizes the power of visual supports. You know, using picture cards to show the steps of a meal, or creating a social story about trying new foods can really help reduce anxiety.
And what about auditory sensitivities? I've had kids who are bothered by the sound of the blender, or even the clinking of silverware.
Yeah, minimizing noise during meal times is key. You might consider noise-canceling headphones, or playing some soft background music.
I've also found that involving the child in meal prep, like we talked about earlier, can help desensitize them to those kitchen sounds.
For sure. It normalizes those sounds and turns them into something positive, associated with a fun activity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from sensory sensitivities to practical strategies. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a journey, not a race. There will be setbacks, there will be days when your child refuses to try anything new, and that's okay.
Absolutely. You know, this guide has a whole section on creating a positive mealtime environment, and it really emphasizes patience and understanding. It's about celebrating those small wins, not focusing on the setbacks.
That's so important. One of my favorite takeaways from the guide is the importance of empowerment. It talks about giving children choices, even small ones, just to help them feel more in control.
I completely agree. Instead of dictating what they have to eat, we can offer choices within a safe range. Like, do you want carrots or green beans? Do you want to use a fork or a spoon? These small choices can make a huge difference in a child's willingness to participate in mealtime.
It's about giving them a sense of agency. And I think it's also crucial to remember that you're not alone in this. There's a whole community of parents, therapists, and dietitians who understand what you're going through and can offer support and guidance.
This guide highlights some inspiring real-life success stories that really emphasize that point. One parent shared how they used food chaining to gradually introduce new textures to their child, starting with just one type of cracker. And over time, their child's diet expanded to include a variety of crunchy snacks, vegetables, and even some softer fruits.
That's incredible. It's amazing what can be achieved with patience and persistence. I'm reminded of a case I had where a child's diet consisted almost entirely of yogurt. We worked with the family to incorporate those familiar flavors and textures into new foods. We added a dollop of yogurt to a smoothie with spinach and berries, slowly decreasing the amount of yogurt over time. Eventually, they were drinking the smoothie without any yogurt at all.
That's awesome. Those stories are so encouraging. They remind us that change is possible, even if it comes in tiny increments.
So for those listening who might be feeling overwhelmed, what's one concrete piece of advice you'd offer? What's a small step they can take this week to make a difference?
I'd say start by focusing on one sense. Choose one sensory challenge your child faces. And try one of the strategies we've discussed. Maybe it's simplifying the visual presentation of their meals, or introducing a new flavor using the flavor masking technique. Even a small change can have a ripple effect.
That's great advice. Don't try to tackle everything at once. Choose one area to focus on and build from there. And I'd add, be patient with yourself and your child. This is a journey, and there will be ups and downs.
You said it. Celebrate the victories. Learn from the setbacks, and remember that every step forward, no matter how small, is a step in the right direction.
As we've been talking about these strategies, I keep thinking about how much creativity and flexibility are really involved in working with these kiddos. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Oh, absolutely not. Every child is so unique. And what works for one might not work for another. It's all about really understanding their individual sensory profiles, their preferences, and even their personalities.
I had this one little boy. He was obsessed with dinosaurs. And he refused to eat anything that wasn't dinosaur food, which in his mind was pretty limited.
Oh, wow. What did you do?
We got creative. We started calling broccoli trees for the dinosaurs to hide in, and mashed potatoes, volcano lava. Suddenly he was eager to devour these previously rejected foods.
That's amazing. It shows how powerful imagination can be. I had a similar experience with a little girl who was all about princesses. She wouldn't touch vegetables until we started calling them magic wands and fairy dust.
I love that.
Mealtimes became a fairy tale adventure, and she was so excited to try these new magical foods.
Those are such great examples. It reminds us that we don't have to be rigid in our approach. Sometimes a little bit of playfulness can go a long way.
Right.
And it's not just about the kids either. I think it's important to acknowledge that this could be a really stressful experience for parents too.
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy for parents to feel overwhelmed, frustrated, and even isolated when they're dealing with these food aversions.
They might worry about their child's health, feel judged by others, or just simply feel exhausted from the constant mealtime battles.
Exactly. This guide does a good job of addressing that emotional side of things. It emphasizes the importance of self-care for parents and reminds them that they're not alone.
There are support groups, online resources, and of course therapists like us who can provide guidance and encouragement.
One thing I always tell parents is to focus on progress, not perfection. Celebrate those small wins, even if it's just a child trying a new food without spitting it out.
Every step forward is a reason to celebrate. And remember, change takes time. It's a process, not an overnight transformation.
Right.
Be patient with yourself and your child. And don't be afraid to seek help when you need it.
We've talked about so many valuable strategies today, from understanding those sensory sensitivities to implementing practical techniques like food chaining and creating that positive mealtime environment.
We've also highlighted the importance of family involvement, empowering children with choices, and seeking support from professionals and other families.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I really want to leave listeners with a sense of hope. Food aversion is a challenge, but it's not insurmountable. With patience, persistence, and the right strategies, you can help your child expand their palate. and develop a healthier relationship with food.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into food aversion in children with autism. We hope you found this episode informative and encouraging. And remember, we're always here to support you on this journey.